Hello and welcome to Scholars Home at Home. I am Carrie Williams, Associate Director, Alumni Events at York University. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's lecture titled Adapting to an Evolving Landscape, How Families Are Managing During the Pandemic with Dr. Heather Prime, Associate Professor, Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Health. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land that I am on. Because we're not all gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website native-land.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York U community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the institution. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably care and share for the Great Lakes region. York University is strengthening its position as a leader in creating a sustainable and inclusive world, placing in the top 35 post-secondary institutions in the respected Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. To learn more about this, you might have read it in our monthly newsletter, the York U Alumni News. It was sent last week. If you didn't receive it, not to worry, you can update your information on our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends, and that should appear in the chat for you. We like to conduct a quick poll before each lecture. Today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen now, and I will give everyone a moment to respond to it. There it is. It's so helpful for our speakers to know who's in the audience and what their knowledge is. Okay, thank you very much for participating in that. So our audience, almost 60% are somewhat informed of the topic. So lots of great opportunity for learning here today. If you need help with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions for our speaker after the lecture during a Q&A period following the presentation. Please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. So we ask you to keep your comments relevant and respectful. I'd like to welcome first Dr. Jennifer Connolly, Professor and Chair, Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Health, to give some updates from the faculty as well as introduce today's speaker. Dr. Connolly, you may turn your camera on now. Great. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie, for that kind introduction. And welcome to all of our participants today to today's webinar. It's nice to see so many of you, and I'm glad. I know this topic is of lots of interest to so many of us, and so it's really terrific to see you here. So, you know, I'm here as chair of our department. Maybe some of you were psych majors, and if so, a special welcome back to you. But I'm here to just welcome you from the department. And, you know, our psychology at York is, it's one of our strongest departments at the university. And we are actually one of the top ranked departments in Canada and known for our work really globally. We especially have a very strong presence in the field of mental health, and we cover the age spectrum of mental health resources from infants to young children and families to adolescents, right up until to the elderly and those who are making other kinds of changes. And so it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Heather Prime, who is one of our newer faculty. We were so lucky in being able to bring Heather to our department because she brings incredible strengths in the field of the mental health of young children and especially supporting families. And it goes without saying that the last few years have been enormously stressful on families and on children. And Heather has made it her priority to study and investigate these, the pandemic and its impact on families. What I have learned about Heather is that she is never satisfied with simply documenting the stressors that children and families feel. Her work is so much about making changes. So once we know there are stressors, her question always is, what do we do next? How can we help families and how can we help young children manage better in this unique time? But also, how do we manage better with all of the stressors of modern life? And so I know that she will bring so much knowledge and information to this session. And I am looking forward to hearing her work. And I know that you will enjoy her talk and that there'll be an opportunity for questions and dialogue afterward. So I will now turn it over to Heather to talk to us about her important research in this area.
Thank you, Dr. Connolly, for a warm introduction. I'm happy to be here. Thank you to the alumni group for inviting me and to everyone for coming today. So I will jump in and pull up my slides. It should be all good. So today I'm excited because I think a topic like this brings people out for various reasons, some of which are likely personal. We're all, human. We've all been parented and many of us are parents, right? So we're all part of a family of origin. And so I think that this topic is relatable to many people. And of course, we've all experienced the pandemic. And then I also assume there's some people here who are interested due to their own work, their own research or professional work or otherwise. The title of my talk is Adapting to an Evolving Landscape, How Families Are Managing During the Pandemic. And I wanted to just start, I added this slide this morning because I was reflecting on the pandemic. And so this is March 11th, 2020, the day I signed my contract with York University. And it also happened to be, as you may know, the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. So since that time, I have become a professor, I have become a parent, and I have become a researcher on the topic of pandemics. And I just put, I've thought about this before, but today thinking about speaking with you, I was really reflecting on that. And a renowned researcher, Froma Walsh, she studies family resilience in response to adversity. And she talks about how families don't bounce back from adversity, but rather they need to bounce forward, right? And I think many of us can relate to this idea of, not thinking about returning to normal, but really evolving to our new lives and bouncing forward. And this is so true of the pandemic. So thanks for sharing on my personal note there. So today I'm going to talk about three things. I forgot to start my timer, so now I'm going to be long. How has the pandemic disrupted children's well-being? And I should say children and parents' well-being. How does COVID-19 disruption get inside the family? And then I think something that is really important is thinking about how we can build resilience within families to help us recover from and bounce forward from the pandemic. So first, we'll talk about how children have been impacted. And I'm just going to slide through a few slides about this. So this was early in the pandemic. Parents were asked how their children's behavior had changed since the beginning of the pandemic. So 32% of 2 to 5 year olds were reported to have deteriorating emotional problems, 30% with deteriorating behavior, and 35% with increases in hyperactivity. So early in the pandemic, parents were noticing that about a third of children were in each of these areas were struggling more. One of the concerns we have is about learning losses. So this is preschool learning losses. And this is out of a really nice study in Uruguay, so different context, but I share it because they compared a large group of preschool children from before the pandemic, cohort of them, to a large group who were in preschool during the pandemic, and looked at differences between them. And so they did see a negative impact on the motor skills, the cognitive skills, so how children are thinking, problem solving, using their language, and their attitudes towards learning. And I think importantly, they documented that this was most pronounced for children who came from lower socioeconomic households and those who had struggles prior to the pandemic starting. So something that a lot of us are really thinking about is how the pandemic is differentially impacting children and families. And so in this study, they did show that these initial inequities have been exacerbated during the pandemic. Moving along the lifespan, this is looking at the global prevalence rates of mental health symptoms in youth. So the dark columns represent pre-pandemic prevalence rates of depression and anxiety, respectively, and the light columns are during the pandemic. And this is based on 29 studies, so it's synthesized data from over 80,000 youth. And what you'll see here is about a doubling of prevalence rates. So hovering around 12 to 13% pre-pandemic, up to 20 and 25% during the pandemic. So cause for concern with respect for youth mental health. And now we're going to keep going to adults. Sorry, I skipped university students. I'm interested in the lifespan, but I tend to do children, youth, and adults. And so this is looking at, it's based on almost 18,000 adults in the UK. And it shows their rates of mental distress before the pandemic, so from 2014 all the way to 2019, and then again in April of 2020. And what you'll see is that the top line is women and the bottom line is men. In the middle solid line is an average of the two. So consistently we see women report more distress than men. And then we also see that from pre-pandemic to April 2020, a big jump for both men and women. And something that they found here was that these increases were 1.5 times larger in parents as compared to non-parents. This is one example among many. There's really quite a bit of evidence showing that parents are really struggling. Not all parents, of course, but that when we do these comparisons of do you have children in the home versus do you not have children in the home, on average, those who are taking care of children are reporting more distress, more stress, more problems during the pandemic. So overall, we're really seeing that early learning and behavior in children, youth mental health, and the mental health of adults are suffering during the pandemic, particularly for adults among parents and women. So, okay, so what I'm really interested in, none of that was my work, it's beautiful work done by other people. I'm really interested in why this is happening. Like the pandemic can be a bit of a black box, right? How does a global pandemic impact the lives of families and children, okay? Or said another way, how does COVID-19 disruption get inside the family? And to answer this, I've been working with colleagues on a study called the CRAMP study, the Child Resilience and Managing Pandemic Emotional Distress in Families study. It includes 549 families, each with 2 children. So that's over 1,000 children. And so this is a partnership with colleagues at the universities of Waterloo and Toronto. And so I'll just show you, families come from primarily 4 regions shown here. The data collection engine is based in the UK. That's why we have so many families from the UK. We've talked to them, we've sent them questionnaires 6 times since May 2020, and we're going out with our 7th wave very soon. And this is the general makeup of the families who are participating. So our first question was, how have they been stressed? And I should have done a poll. You could have answered this for me, I'm sure. But we asked them 24 different scenarios. These are some examples that we asked them around income, developing routines, being separated from loved ones, and so on. And we looked at how they kind of clustered together, how they, the themes that emerged from these stressors. And what we see is that in these families with children ages, I should have said, sorry, 5 to 18, there's these 3 clusters of stressors. One is related to finances. People are reporting income loss, job insecurity, increased debt, concerns about providing for their loved ones. Then, of course, we have this, what we call relational stress. It's been hard to get along, right? Feeling crowded in the home, more altercations, more conflict, or in contrast, more withdrawal, right? So people are more emotionally detached. People are reporting both of those things. Problems with child management. And then we have this 3rd cluster that we refer to as pandemic specific stress. So this is anxiety or panic around being in public spaces, anxiety from exposure to the news and media about the pandemic, fear for health of loved ones or for public health, okay? And so what we're seeing is that in terms of experiencing stress and the impact of stress, there are some groups in our sample who are particularly impacted. So first, mothers. We're seeing that mothers are reporting more pandemic stress, as I've showed on the previous slide, than fathers. And they're also reporting worse mental health problems amid the pandemic. We did see one exception to this. So fathers who report a history of trauma or a history of adversity are reporting significantly, higher levels of stress and mental health problems. We saw this particularly around substance use. So fathers who are experiencing a lot of stress because of the pandemic, so maybe financial stress, family stress, anxiety about their health or loved one's health, they are, if they have a history of trauma, they're more likely to be using having problematic substance use right now. Okay, so we're thinking about who are we concerned about, right? Because that helps us guide our public health interventions. It helps us guide our more targeted mental health services. So for us, we're thinking about mothers, we're thinking about fathers with a history of trauma. And then with children, those who had existing mental health problems, not surprisingly, have been suffering more in our sample. So their initial mental health levels predict worsening mental health over time, and that has shown to have implications for how they're getting along with their parents, right? So it's causing more problems within their parent-child relationships. And then when we're thinking about, okay, so how does stress get inside the family? When there is higher pandemic stress, so parents are reporting on their questionnaires, yes, we're experiencing this and this and this and this, then they're also more typically reporting that their children are showing higher levels of anger, depression, and anxiety. They themselves are feeling more hopeless and nervous, and their family bonds have been weakened. So they're confiding in each other less, and they struggle to work as a team. And I put this in, this is best kind of understood in a circular framework, because we know and showed in this study that increases in any of these lead to increases in the other. Okay, so we are all interconnected within our families. We're family systems. So how one person in the family is doing necessarily impacts how everyone else is doing. And I'll speak a bit more about that. So in our study, children who were showing more mental health problems earlier in the pandemic had parents who were feeling more distressed later in the pandemic, and their family bonds were ruptured later in the pandemic. And we saw the reverse as well. Okay, so what can we do? So how do we build family resilience? What can we do? I'm going to speak from what can we do within our family's perspective, though I think we all know that there's a role outside of ourselves that has to do with policies and systems, public health, education systems, etc. Today, I'm going to speak about what we can do as family members. So before I get into that, I just want to put the question out there, and I will answer it. What is resilience? Resilience is a hot topic. I don't have data to support that, but it is everywhere, and for better and for worse, because I think there's some misunderstanding of what resilience is, and it can kind of activate people's emotions. So what is resilience? I should have had a slide, what is it not? But I'll just stick with my current slides. So officially, it's an individual's positive adaptation following exposures to challenges. So it's a person's ability to, as I said, bounce forward after experiencing challenges, to lead a fulfilling life despite adversity. So returning to well-being for kids, being able to play and enjoy their friendships, being able to learn, being able to regulate their emotions. So being able to do the things that we're meant to do, even though we've had significant challenges in our lives. That is resilience. I think the most important point is the second box, which is that it is not an internal process. And that's where where the misconceptions come. Resilience is not inherent to an individual. We are not born resilient. A child is not in itself or in themselves resilient. Resilience is built, right? We build resilience. Of course, our individual characteristics, play a role. However, we build resilience within our relationships, within the systems that we exist in, and the policies surrounding us, and the skills that we develop within the interactions we are part of every day. Okay, so this is really important. I love this quote or this idea by Ann Maston. Ann Maston is a psychologist. She's a leader in the study of resilience and has been for decades. Of course, her work is very relevant right now. And she talks about the ordinary magic of resilience. So I'll read this. Resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic of ordinary, normative human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of children, in their families and relationships, and in their communities. So what is she saying? She's saying, when she studied children for decades on what builds resilience, children who have experienced war crimes, poverty, natural disasters, now the pandemic. And what makes them resilient is not some magic, not some rare event or rare child that is resilient. It's the mundane, ordinary experiences, the normal, that allows us to flourish, allows children to flourish in the face of challenge. So things like having a trusted adult, a trusted parent in their lives, returning to school and normal activities. So returning to school MS and talks about, in refugee camps, how one of the first things they try to do is to get a structure and an educational experience happening in some of the camps that she was looking at because that return to normalcy is one of the indicators that helps kids build that resilience. Having access to high quality childcare, being back in school, having access to schooling experiences, all these things, these are kind of the rights of children, are the things that make them resilient. So it's not magic, it's ordinary life. And it's in the absence of the ordinary that children continue to suffer. I'm just checking my time here. I'll move through this pretty quickly, I think. So how can we promote family resilience? How can we promote resilience within our families? So, as families going through the pandemic, we're all going to have narratives about what the pandemic means, right? And that will look different for different families based on the stressors you've experienced, cultural, religious dimensions, and that sort of thing. But some of the things we think about that can be helpful are fostering a sense of being in it together, right? So we as a family are going to get through this together. To share a positive outlook. So that's not that's not like a toxic positivity, but refraining from forecasting the worst case scenario and thinking about this as time limited, although of course sometimes it doesn't feel time limited, but time limited and manageable. And then finally, engaging in rituals and routines. So I think I was reading at the beginning of the first lockdown, parents were reporting on average 13 new rules and rituals on average in their family, right? So it's like all our structures and routines were flipped upside down, and they kind of keep going up and down, right? As these waves come and go, and vaccinations come and go, and masks come and go, and all of these things. So finding those new routines and importantly rituals, which are the kind of meaningful routines in our lives, can really support children and families to get through challenging times. Co-parenting relationships are really important. So this is one of those, it's simple but not easy. So I will say, be a united front, act as a team, right? We want, as co-parents, if you have a co-parent, whether you live together or you're separated, the goal, the aspiration is to be a team. So working, you might not start with shared values, but finding your shared values, finding your shared rules and limits, what you want your family to look like, supporting one another rather than undermining one another. This is challenging, and what I recommend to families is to work on it, and preferably to work on it not in front of children, right? So not let it play out in front of our children, but or it does, we know it does sometimes, but then to come back and say, okay, that didn't go well, what do we want to do differently next time? And maybe even to connect with your kids about it and say, that didn't go how we wanted, this is what we meant to say. Okay. And then the last kind of system, so we're thinking whole families, co-parent, and then the parent-child, right? These different parts of the family system. And for the parent-child relationship, we're asking parents to be a leader, right? So you're nurturing, you're guiding, and you're protecting. You are the leader of the family. Try to pay attention to the positive. So maybe not all of us, but I personally, sometimes we're drawn to the negative. Don't do this, don't do that. I have a 3-year-old, so maybe I do that even more than others. I'm not sure, maybe we'll grow out of it. But my point is that we try to notice the positive, right? So thank you for doing this. I really liked how you did that. Thanks so much for helping your little sister with her homework, etc. That doesn't mean that we're not setting limits. It's important to have family rules and structures, as long as everyone knows what the rules are and what the consequences are if you have them. That's the most important thing. So you're coming up with rules and consequences ahead of time, rather than kind of flying by the seat of your pants. That's when things can start to feel chaotic. So I'll just do a quick, just show you some quick evidence here. I like this study, it came out recently. So just to try and summarize it. So on the x-axis here, we have parents' distress. And then on the y-axis, how warm they are with their children. Okay, so what you would expect is that as we're more distressed, you're less warm with your children. Okay, it's pretty intuitive. We've seen that a lot, time and time again. As parents report they're more stressed, they get along less with their kids. That's a common finding. This study was cool because they showed that that happened. Yes, in this solid black line is for when couples didn't support one another all that much. But when you had high co-parenting cohesion, so meaning the co-parenting, the unit, the parenting unit was strong, that didn't happen. Okay, so as I say here, parent distress is related to being less warm with children, but not if you have a supportive relationship with your co-parent. And I just love that. It just shows it's what we call a buffering effect or a protective effect. It shows that we can actually protect one another, protect each other from one another in a great way, right? Like I'm having a bad day, but that support with my partner will actually protect me from or buffer against me letting that spill over into my relationship with my child. So just to summarize, we're seeing that many children, youth, and parents are really having a challenging time right now. And of course, some families are more at risk than others. We know that if even one person in the family is struggling, then that can have a negative impact on all family members, and that becomes circular for better and for worse. So for worse, meaning my bad day impacts your bad day, but it also means that we can kind of intervene and circumvent that process. If we can stop that somewhere in the system, then it can have positive effects too. And then the last point, families can build resilience and buffer against the negative effects of the pandemic. So it's really this balancing act where we acknowledge the pandemic has been really hard, and we have some power to build that strength within our families, and we are the healing, right? I promise this is my last slide. In my work, I really believe in the healing power of families, that ordinary magic of what families can do to help one another deal with adversity. Okay. And that's it. Thank you very much. And that's it for today.
I think it's back to me now to lead a Q&A session. So thank you, Heather, for that really clear and informative presentation and discussion of how the pandemic has affected all of us. In some ways, maybe it's distressing to think of the negative impact a pandemic has had, but I think also when we all feel distress, sometimes it's good to know that we're not the only families, we're not the only individuals for whom this pandemic has created inordinate levels of stress. And we're all pretty good at coping with some stress, but there's points where stress is more than we can cope with, and then we can see from your data and from your information that there can be a downward spiral, and most importantly, that there are ways that we can move forward from that. So I invite questions and comments from the audience. Please just put them in the chat or raise your hand. Well, no, I guess you can't raise your hand. This is in a webinar format. Take that one back. Don't raise your hand. Put it in the chat, or there's a Q&A section where you could also put a question. And we will moderate them, and we'll get some answers from Heather about where we should be going now. So I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator to ask some questions that I have based on Heather's talk. So Heather, what would you say to a parent who says, actually, I can see my child is really distressed. I can see that my child is becoming very isolated and not connecting with other friends. Let's imagine it's a 7-year-old and spending too much time in their room and seems depressed and upset to me. Well, what would you say to this parent? What the parent says, what do I do? What can I do to support my child at this point?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest challenges that parents have is knowing when enough isn't not enough is enough, but when it's too much, right? And you know, you're seeing these changes, but is this normal because we're in a pandemic or because, you know, for whatever reason? So what I usually think about with parents is, you know, the baseline of where your child started. So you want to think about changes from baseline. So has there been a significant shift? You want to think about intensity. So how intense are the behaviors, and also frequency, how frequent is it? So is it once in a while they're staying in the room, or is it every day? Is it getting worse? You want to think about comparing to other children, what you would expect for their age. And then also, I think maybe most importantly is it getting in the way? Right? So is it getting in the way of them being a kid? This is a 7-year-old. Are they still engaging with school? Or do they want to see their friends? Are they engaging with their family? So to kind of, and these are all questions you want to ask yourself for, do I need to get help? I mean, you can always get help. There's no reason to not go and ask someone for help. But those are kind of, it's the intensity, what you would expect for their age, and if it's getting in the way. And if it's, you know, one or all three of those things, you might want to reach out and just have a consult with a psychologist, a social worker, another mental health practitioner. And there's so much out there, right? So talking to someone about that can really help. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, that's great advice. Thank you for that. Yeah. Well, I see there's a few questions from the audience, so I will hold my questions and I will bring up some of those that are showing up now in the chat. Here is one. Do you have any recommendations for public health interventions in terms of supporting families to build resilience in their children?
Public health interventions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about this a lot, and I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but I think about these kind of low cost, far reaching interventions. So I think they're important. Do I know if there are any? I'm not sure. So we have lots of kind of public health supports, you know, things like early on centers are really, you know, early on centers are one example of kind of public health support for young families that can help build some of these things. But, you know, some of the work we're doing in my lab and with collaborators is developing these really low intensity programs where parents can, that could be rolled out, where parents can learn some of the skills I taught you in one slide today, but it's kind of a self-directed learning module, that sort of thing, because we know parents need different things. Some people just need to read about it or watch a video about it, and then that's kind of a nice preventative approach. Other families would do better with an interventionist, a clinician, to help teach them and practice. And there are many examples of programs that have been implemented. So one example is the Triple P program, is a parenting program that has these different tiers from less intense to most intense that have been kind of implemented at, you know, in kind of universal ways. So that's what I had to say about that. I'm sorry, I hope I answered your question, but happy to talk more if you want to email me.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's public health has been so focused on reporting the prevalence of COVID. I sometimes think they forget that there are other roles that they can play in minimizing the impact. So thank you for those helpful comments. So let's move on a little bit. I see there is another question, and let me just read this one to you, to do with government. So the question is whether York is working with the government to promote mental health in offering supports to families. I guess, you know, whether you in your work connect with any government or community agencies, whether there are others at York whose work intersects with community agencies to promote resilience and well-being. That's a really interesting question. And I wonder if you have any thoughts, Heather, about this.
So I may not be the best person to ask this, and actually, Jennifer, you may be better, but okay, so certainly many of us, including myself, have community-based partnerships, working with people who are already in the community to either help with program evaluation or rolling out programming. I give the example of early on centers. I'm involved with them as a way to both support their programming and also access families, because you know, sometimes we researchers, we have these programs and no one wants to take part in them, right? Because of whatever reason. So I'm like, here, please, like, use our program. So certainly there's also, you know, large initiatives coming out of the psychology department that are government funded. Dr. Pillai Riddell is leading I'm really bad with these sorts of details, but is leading like a $5 million mental health initiative. So there's certainly funding from the government. I'm not sure about I'm sure they exist, but I don't know the kind of partnerships where the government's actually helping to reach families and that sort of thing. So, but it probably exists.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right that so many of our mental health researchers are working with governments and with community agencies. We can think of governments at so many different levels, whether it's at the community level, working with community partners, or at the provincial level and working in hospitals or working in community care centers, and also at a national level, whether we're able to join with other groups who are funded by government and to promote well-being in children and youth and to support families. So I think I would say, just if I could add to your response, that there are our researchers are definitely involved in these efforts. But I think at the same time, government has not been entirely consistent across all the different levels in terms of what they're looking for and what they would like to support. It's a bit of a patchwork, I would say, right now. And I think if government were to, at all levels, were to really take seriously the importance of supporting children and families in a consistent way, I think that we would really be able to have a much stronger impact. Anyway, you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear Heather. So I shall stop there. And I'm going to turn to another question that I see, which is, yeah, this is interesting. How do I know if a child who's having trouble in school, maybe with their math or their writing, maybe even reading, is this due to the pandemic and being in an online school environment, or could there be underlying learning issues here? It's a really important question.
I think that's really tricky because I'm trying to differentiate between my knowledge based on reading the literature versus I have friends who are teachers and just noting learning losses. And I think both are really important perspectives. But yes, that, you know, there are these learning losses happening on average, but then we also know, you know, for many kids, they're doing just fine, right? And then it's for some, they're struggling. So I think part of the issue is we don't want to normalize things too much. Like if a child who's struggling in school to say, oh, it's because of online learning. Well, it may be because of online learning, but that doesn't mean that they don't need support, right? So we might be able to say why it happened, but it might be that a child was a bit vulnerable to begin, like they were doing okay, but it was a bit challenging for them and they needed to be in person close to the teacher and reduced distractions. And then they got online and all that fell apart and then they fell behind. They still, I think, need some help. And I'm not saying this isn't a doom and gloom. They could easily, bounce back. We don't know. But I always think it's important to keep a finger on the pulse. So I would say to watch it and to speak with a teacher, speak with potentially a school support team or principal. Back to what I said initially, thinking about how they were doing before. So were they already kind of struggling and then you're seeing a big decline? Like it's the change. How are they compared to their peers before? How are they now? And is interfering with them, do they not want to go to school? It's harder for them to do homework. Are they falling further and further behind? Parents have this kind of intuition, and I usually say to lean into that and just ask, consult with someone about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you for that. So, I'm watching our time, and I think we have time to just squeeze in one more question. And so let me just read this. And it's a question concerning the cramp study that you reported. And they wonder how much of the sample consists of single parent households. What can be other ways that help buffer if there isn't another parent? Can this study be extended to families or to communities?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the short answer is yes. So our sample had, I think it was like 90% two-parent families. This is one of the unfortunate things, pandemic started in March, we started collecting data in May. It's like when you move quickly, we lost some representativeness, right? We would have liked to have some two-parent, some single-parent homes, et cetera, but we didn't. But I can still speak to that, that absolutely. So that was just one example, the co-parenting unit. I mean, the co-parenting unit is a huge stressor and it can be a support. For single parent families, we're thinking about individual, like the parents' individual mental health and ways that can be maintained or promoted. We're thinking absolutely about extended family. So extended family is important for two-parent families as well, and also more or less in different cultural kind of configurations, but particularly is a strong resource for single-parent families and the larger community, right? So anywhere that you can fill that bucket or fill the oxygen, right, as a single parent, we know that will have positive ripple effects on how that single parent parents, how they get along with their kids, how the whole family gets along. One of my colleagues recently shared that they were looking at data, and I'm not sure if it's published or not, but that they were looking to see how single parents were doing it, expecting that single parents would be more impacted by the pandemic than two-parent households. And they didn't find that. And they're, so this is kind of anecdotal because I can't remember the specifics, if they showed this or if they interpreted it this way, that in some ways single parents have for years, they have a history of building up their networks, right? And it's almost like their resilience muscle has been built, right? Like they have to know who their extended family is that will support them and who, how they will cope with a shortage of parenting capacity, et cetera, in a way that when the pandemic came, it was like kind of more of the same versus potentially people who haven't had that practice were kind of left floundering. So that's just like a one-off. Don't take that with too much. You can take that with a grain of salt. But yes, anywhere we can get our resources from will help us.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. Well, I'm going to end our Q&A here. I thank you so much for your responses and for your research, and to our audience for asking such great questions. And I will turn it back to Carrie at this point.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer and Heather. Thank you so much for your time. Heather, your research is so, to say it's timely is an understatement. And thank you also, Jennifer, for hosting today's session. For myself, I'm a parent of 2 young junior age kids, and not that you need one person to validate what you've done, but I can validate for you that that was exactly what happened. So much of what you reported, what you've researched, what you said the cycles are, is exactly what happened. And returning to school, coming out of school, returning to school was like a light switch in terms of kids, their anxiety, their approach, everything. It was literally like a light switch. So I just want to thank you so much for doing the research, compiling the research, asking the questions, but so importantly, taking the time to share it, because knowing that we're not alone in this, knowing that this is actually happening with lots of families, with lots of children, is exceptionally helpful in dealing with it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah. Ironically, you and I signed to join York on the exact same day. So if you ever decide to do research on adults starting a new job in a pandemic, we will make space for you here. It was it was the day the World Health Organization declared the pandemic, and I'm signing, so away we went. So thank you very much. You're both welcome to turn your video off now if you choose. For those of you who would like to share today's session with family and friends, certainly those that are co-parenting or with children, please do that. It will be posted on our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. You can also watch past lectures that you may have missed. We have one last poll question for you, and that is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. Our next Scholars Hub at Home session is scheduled for May 18th and is titled Ukrainian Sovereignty and Identity, a critical discussion on the war in Ukraine, and that is with Dr. Karen Krasny, professor in the Faculty of Education, also very timely. And also next week, you may join us for Be the Change, just in time for World Bee Day. That event takes place on Thursday, May 19th at noon. You may register and learn more about our webinars at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Until next time, thank you very much and keep well.